Defying the sacred chickens before battle often meant catastrophic defeat. Just ask Pulcher at Drepana. It involved feeding a brood and delaying if they wouldn't eat while enemies closed in. Nevertheless, Roman commanders repeatedly took on this daunting ritual. They even competed for the privilege because, contrary to popular belief, everyone wanted the birds to decide. In this video, we ask why Roman generals were willing to risk ruin to obey sacred chickens. Drepana 249 BCE. The wind snaps through the rigging, the sea plays across the hulls, and Publius Claudius Pulcher stands at the fore, his nerves jangling as the captain's bark orders, and the loom of battle begins to tighten. He orders the sacred chickens brought to the grain, a visible choreography of power and augury that must travel from desk to deck, from altar to oar. The birds, starved and skittish, refuse the offered grain. In Livy's account, the moment freezes the fleet, an omen that refuses to be read. Pulcher, unnerved, is said to have snapped, "Let them drink then," and flung the birds into the sea. The fleet reels into defeat, and moral blame blooms around him like sea spray. This is the famous moralized image, but the everyday friction of omen taking, the stall, the weather, the noise, also mattered. On the decks, the Polarius, the soldier whose sole duty was tending the sacred fowl, juggled two urgent tasks at once: keep the birds calm, keep the grain dry, and catch a readable sign amid gust spray and the clamor of a marching fleet. Livy records that officers could delay action until the third watch of the night, so auspices might be observed, a reminder that ritual timing could stall or shove a campaign. In the roar of oarsmen, the scrape of rigging, and the gulls' cries, a single wrong gust or a frightened bird could turn a carefully plotted maneuver into a scramble. The Polarius' fingers moved as much to soothe nerves as to read entrails or notice a speck of flight that might tilt a strategic decision. The ritual language, the material traces, and the practical contingency all converged to reveal something bigger than a single bad omen. Archaeology may not yield a chicken coop aboard a trireme, but it does show altars, inscriptions, and votive deposits that accompanied armies and fleets, confirming that religious practice traveled with Rome's campaigns. Epigraphic and legal texts attest to a disciplina auguralis kept partly secret by pontiffs, and augurs a system that could both legitimize a commander's decision and undermine it if the signs were misread or mismanaged. The tension between devotion and the slow, stubborn logic of war made battlefield divination indispensable, yet precarious, a ritualized gamble with God's ships and reputations at stake. Pulcher's misstep was as much personal as political. A consul who bungled the signs risked more than a lost battle. He risked professional ruin and the erosion of honor in a society where virtues and the dona of war could forge or fracture a man's entire arc. The drama translates to a modern classroom of leadership. When the sign from the gods collides with the clock, the person in command bears the consequences for better or worse. This is not merely superstition, it is a window into Roman social order where a single decision, translating omen into action, could redraw a career and a campaign in a heartbeat. Two moments of primary voice anchor the scene. Pulcher himself, "Let them drink then." And as the Polarius whispered to the wind-wet deck, "The omens are against us." The first line crystallizes a reckless certainty, the second, a wary admission that authority rides on signs the mind dimly interprets. As Tacitus would later note in his reflections on Rome's self-justifying rituals, the memory of Drepana would outlive the fault shaping how generals spoke of luck, ritual, and responsibility. In a world where a ritual could win or lose a fleet, a single failed sign opened a door to catastrophe, and to a political and personal reckoning that echoed through the ages. Modern parallels abound: a corporate board tilted by a single misunderstood signal, a military operation hinged on a single fragile omen, and the human drama that follows. Lake Trasimene woke to a damp gray dawn, the lake's surface half veiled in fog as Flaminius's column pressed inland along the shore. The third watch had barely thrown off sleep, and men, plebeians, and their allied socii, felt the ache of marching without rest, the urge to strike before Hannibal could melt away into the morning. Livy records the drama with intimate detail, the anxious whispers in the light booted, ranks the creak of wagons, the breathed curses of impatience as the general urged forward. There was no time for ritual for Flaminius, only momentum. A political man intoxicated by speed, a commander who believed haste could outrun enemy cunning. Yet the shore offered a different script, a test that Rome handed from generation to generation, what the gods might say through a handful of birds. At the center of that script stood two hands, augur and keeper of the sacred chickens, who fed the birds before the coming engagement. The test was crisp and binary. If the birds ate, the omen was good, and battle could begin. If they refused, the army must wait. The sacred birds ate, the augur would later report, therefore the omen is good for battle. And if the fowl showed hesitance, the keeper would insist. If the birds refused, delay the battle. As Tacitus would note in later reflection on Roman divination rites, could be invoked or brushed aside to political effect. Yet here the birds carried a nerve-wracking tangible pressure. Eat and advance, refuse and retreat. The crowd in Flaminius's mind pressed for action, the augury pressed for restraint, a clash of portents that promised catastrophe or commendation. In the shadow of this ritual hung a grim precedent. The memory of Publius Claudius Pulcher, fierce, furious, and infamous, haunted the moment. The fleet sailors would tell the tale. Pulcher, furious at the sacred chickens, refusal to eat, cried, "Let them drink," and cast the birds into the sea. Livy's account makes the irony stark. Arrogance toward signs invites disaster, and divine displeasure follows human bravado. The omen in Trasimene could echo what the earlier victory at Mylae or the Drepana debacle suggested, depending on whether men treated the gods as checkmates or as counsel. The image was not simply superstition, it was a practical logic of risk and authority that shaped how Roman generals argued with heaven. When Flaminius finally gave the order, the ritual faltered under the pressure of real terrain and real enemies. Hannibal's ambush came with a veil of fog, and the Romans, plebeians thrust forward by a populist commander, allied socii pressing on their flanks, found themselves caught in lanes too narrow for maneuver and too open to hidden spears. Flaminius himself fell amid the slaughter, a consul exposed far from the safe lines of discipline or familiar enemy. The human stakes were brutally personal, the loss of comrades, the shock of friends betrayed by terrain they believed under Roman control, the sudden collapse of a political program built on speed and popular trust. The consequence was not only military but social. The plebs, the socii, the Senate in Rome, each faced a reckoning about faith in omens, leadership, and the promises of rapid action. This is how a handful of sacred birds could alter a fate larger than any single man's ambition. As the drama unfolded, one can hear the older Roman logic at work. Virtues, manliness, courage, excellence, was measured here as much in willingness to heed a sign as in the courage to press forward. A modern echo rings through the ages. This would be like a risk-averse project team ignoring a data dashboard, because a superstition or political desire to act decisively overrides the numbers. In Rome, the ritual of a few birds made war feel personal, and personal decisions, whether to advance or delay, made history. In this ship-crowded moment, the scene tilts away from bronze and sail to something far smaller and far more dangerous, a Polarius with a bowl of grain. The officer, often a public slave or freedman, was the hinge where piety, law, and command met. He fed the sacred pulley, watched their pecks and refusals, and then carried those tiny verdicts like a courier to the admiral and the augurs. The weight of his eyes, not the weight of bronze, could decide whether a fleet would cut the waves or wait for a more auspicious hour. And so, under the hot Sicilian sun, Publius Claudius Pulcher demanded the birds. Verdict, a ritual that felt absurd to the uninitiated, yet bound the fate of thousands. If they will not eat, let them drink. Pulcher snapped the line echo of a tradition that said omens could authorize or forbid sea power in a single gesture. The Polarius watched with a precision born of centuries of training and fear. Grain spilled into the wooden bowl, salt air curling around his shoulders as the birds approached like quiet-winged jurors. If the pecks came in a certain pattern, the day could be set for battle. If the pattern stalled or reversed, prudence could silence the ship's prow. These ordinary actions, feeding, observing, reporting, were folded into the acta and the unwritten disciplina augurales. Pontiffs and augurs kept ritual records to justify swift, decisive moves or to restrain ambitions that exceeded the law. In this light, the Polarius was not a spectator, but a governor of imperium, his grain, and glances the smallest levers of political power. The scene bleeds into memory as a moral drama. A low-status man with a bowl could shield lives by delaying an attack, or condemn them by giving the signal to sail. The human stakes sharpen as the omens are interpreted and reinterpreted. The augurs could reverse a decision with a single pronouncement. A commander who ignored bad signs risked defeat, disgrace, and the loss of imperium itself. As Livy puts it, the omens were a language, the gods' own handwriting on the day's possibilities, and a wrong reading could collapse years of political maneuvering into one seaborne catastrophe. The Polarius's message was literal and immediate: if the birds repudiate the grain, the fleet does not weigh anchor. The account isn't merely superstition, it is the political mechanism by which a republic tempered ambition with ritual law, a tension historians still debate. In Pulcher's case, the augury was read as unfavorable, and the verdict was read aloud before the ship slipped from harbor. The moment crystallizes a stark truth: the ritual mattered because it existed at the intersection of faith, law, and military command. The consequences were brutal and public. The fleet sailed, the birds did not feed, and Drepana burned a chapter into Roman memory. In Livy's telling, the decision cascaded into political consequence. A commander's legitimacy could be questioned, his operations blocked, and his imperium weakened by a chorus of legal and religious obstacles. This is where the competitors approach. Private resolve, public frailty, and the cost of personal pride gets another shade. The acta and the disciplina augurales become not mere ceremony, but a battlefield of authority. The Polarius's verdict once whispered echoes through republican institutions, reminding us that war in Rome began as much in the tent of a priest as in the deck of a ship. Modern parallels land hard here. This is like a joint special operation where two senior officers race to claim a posthumous victory, while intelligence and weather reports are weighed in court of omens. It would be like a Navy SEAL and an Army Ranger both claiming credit for killing a high-value target, each arguing that the same signs, intel, timing, and risk, justify their sole triumph. The Roman ritual scripted a similar drama: law, religion, and personal duty, entangled so tightly that a single bowl of grain could decide not just a battle but a career, a family's standing, and the republic's moral economy. The sacred chickens were not quaint relics, they were a legal mechanism, a visible knot, binding state power to divine sanction and human judgment. Pulcher's chickens thus endure in memory as a warning: to treat ritual as optional is to gamble with imperium itself. They trusted a brood of chickens with the fate of fleets and families. Yet the smallest ritual could echo through a gens as surely as a triumphal procession. The clamor of state and household wove together in the sight of the sacred. Coups: a general's career, a family's fortune, a line of descendants, all bound to whether the birds ate or refused. Why would elites risk empire on a few beaks and a priest's reading? Because in Rome, religion and reputation were not private beliefs, but family business, the currency that paid for offices, pensions, and marriage alliances. The tale begins at sea off Sicily in 249 BCE. Publius Claudius Pulcher commanded Rome's fleet in the First Punic War, and for reasons steeped in ritual pride ordered that the sacred chickens be fed before battle. They refused. According to Livy, Pulcher's response was instantaneous and brazen: let them drink. The scene slides into a rough sensory memory. The salt spray the creak of timbers, the birds pecking or not, yet the gods seemed unmoved. The Romans suffered a crushing defeat at Drepana. As Guy de la Baidière notes, this was more than bad luck, it was a public admonition that a commander who flouted auspices invited not only military failure, but a stain on his house. The birds' silence carried the will of Jupiter into the lungs of the Republic, and the ripple of shame extended far beyond the key. Pulcher's fate mattered because in Rome religion and reputation were kin. A successful general could enrich his gens with money offices, and prestige a sacrilegious misstep invited fines, public humiliation, and a stain that echoed through tombs and inscriptions. Valerius Maximus and other biographers cast Pulcher not as a mere unlucky admiral, but as a man whose impiety corrupted his line. Yet the flip side was equally persuasive. Obedience to omens could exalt the humblest soldier and elevate a family to magistracy. The political economy of the Republic rewarded ritual fidelity as surely as martial prowess. Inscriptions across Italy named the Polarius, the freedman or officer who tended the sacred chickens, and inscribed the social legitimacy that ritual service could confer. The sacred chicken's keeper could become a marker of social identity, a sign that piety, not wealth, could open doors. This was not superstition severed from social logic. As the scholars emphasize, Romans believed the gods actively judged public acts. An augur or pontiff bore the weight of those judgments. Even a Polarius' simple record of whether the birds ate carried institutional consequence. For a patrician house, the wrong omen could marginalize politics. For a plebeian officer or freedman tethered to ritual office, it could mean fines, lost pay, or the erasure of a career that sustained a family. The clucking mattered because Rome's moral economy demanded it. Religion, reputation, and resources merged into a single mechanism of social ascent or decline. This is not a parable about irrational fear, it is a story of incentives. The same incentives that drive a modern boardroom to rubber stamp a risky fusion, or in a crisis to treat data as destiny. It would be like a Navy SEAL and an Army Ranger each claiming credit for the same mission, while the company barters away its credibility. And yet the same logic produced another form of glory. In 209 BCE, Scipio Africanus pushed New Carthage's defenses and earned the Corona Muralis, the mural crown. A dispute between Quintus Trebellius and Sextus Digitus over who first breached the wall triggered arbitration. Livy records the moment as a test of who could share the glory. The arbiters declared that both had entered the breach, and both should be honored, the crown symbolizing not just personal valor, but the social currency of the legion and the republic. The line from Livy: "The men dashed on in the face of wounds and missiles, and neither walls nor armed men standing on them can restrain them from vying with one another in the attempt to climb," encapsulates a Roman ideal. Honor carried a cost, and the family that endured the cost could rise. Modern parallels illuminate the point. When institutions reward performance, everyone seeks entry to the same ladder. When pride and ritual logic drive decisions, families ride the elevator of reputation together. The clucking birds, the corona on the wall, the inscriptions in stone, all show that in Rome personal choices reverberated through kin and community, past, present, and into memory. They approached the sacred chickens as if they were a weather report carved into wood and bone. The Polarius, a low-born slave tasked with tending the birds and translating their sign, moved along the deck with a measured, almost ritual gait. Salt spray speckled his tunic, ropes groaned in the wind, the drums of the oars beat like a heartbeat in a chest of cedar and oil. The fleet lay off the Sicilian coast, its commanders already listening for a god's voice in the crackle of the rigging and the scuff of sandals on deck. This was not superstition for them, it was a language of duty, a link between a soldier's courage and the city's welfare. Then the moment arrived that would feed the age-old parable. The feed was laid before the sacred chickens, a ritual the Polarius had performed 100 times. The birds clucked and fussed then. Nothing. They did not peck, they did not nibble, they did not respond to the corn as they should. A hush spread through the fleet, the sea itself seeming to lean in to hear what would be said next. The Polarius's lips barely moved as he watched the birds, listening to a sign no general could mistake. Livy notes the moment with surgical exactness. The Polarius whispered, "The omens are plain. If the birds do not peck, we must not set sail." The line hung in the air as Pulcher's own voice broke it. "Let them drink." He turned away from the keeper to marshal the men, as if the cosmos could be persuaded by audacity alone. The dialogue that followed braided duty, pride, and fear. Pulcher's retort, recorded by Livy as one of the bold, ruinous lines in Roman memory, was more than a challenge to fate. It was a challenge to the social order the city depended on. The augur's logic lay behind every move. If the gods withdraw their favor, every plank and rope is a wager against the sea. The omens are language, as Cicero would argue later into divination. But in the moment, the language was spoken by birds, and by a keeper who stood at the boundary between slavery and virtue, between a soldier's oath and a city's honor. The crew's morale rode on the keeper's account of a tiny, absurd mechanism that could decide life and death, the captain's career, the consul's reputation, the legate's power. Everything hinged on those few clucking moments. The consequences arrived not in the roar of battle, but in the quiet after. Within weeks, the fleet was crushed at the Battle of Drepana, a catastrophe that ancient historians would later frame as impiety inviting disaster. Livy's moral is explicit. Impiety invites disaster, but the social machinery, Pieta's pax deorum and mos maiorum, had to hold even when a commander chose to gamble with the god's own ledger. The keeper of the chickens, the Polarius, emerged as a pivot between classes, a mundane functionary, whose reports could move a consul to risk or retreat a slave, whose tiny measured report could decide the fate of sailors, a fleet, and a republic. In the eyes of contemporaries and centuries of readers, the chickens' fickleness is less a superstition than a test of Roman political nerve. This was a drama staged by the city's institutions as much as by its birds. The ritual persisted. An evolved augury grew. More regulated pontiffs tightened the disciplina auguralis, and leaders learned to maneuver ritual authority to their advantage. The episode showed a civilization that treated signs as responsibilities, signs to be read, argued over, and acted upon, even when the cost was blood or career. As Tacitus would remind later readers, the gods were never a detail in Rome. They were the architecture of every decision, from the oars to the Senate. Modern parallels sharpen the ache of the scene. This would be like a fleet commander shrugging off radar data because a gut feeling says risk is romantic or necessary, a choice that makes a decisive battle look like fate rather than strategy. And yet in Rome, the same drama that could ruin a career or sink a ship also welded a city together. The Polariuses report the consul, will the augur's reading, and the legion's marching heartbeats, all bound to a single, ridiculous, indispensable truth: the gods are listening, and we must answer in the only language they understand. The sacred cluck mattered because Rome taught its citizens to live with risk, to justify action through ritual, and to carry responsibility through the chain that stretched from the Polarius to the patrician curia. The chickens did more than decide a battle, they defined a republic. On the quarterdeck, off Drepanum, Publius Claudius Pulcher faced a choice as old as Rome, and as slippery as the sea: trust the omen, or trust the legs and oars of his men. The sacred chickens, kept in a carved coop, fastened to the gunwale, paused above their feed like a public tribunal about to deliver judgment. The augur's scroll lay open, the crew's chatter thinning into a tense hush, and the sun-warmed boards creaked with the weight of expectation. Sailors craned their necks, teeth set, hands ready to cut lines or haul sails on a moment's whim. The ritual, a public protocol for distributing responsibility, had become a high-stakes form of social technology, turning uncertainty into a visible, if uncomfortable, path forward. The moment came when the birds pecked nothing, and as the superstition dictates, the sign should be taken as a warning to delay. Pulcher's jaw tightened. The dice were cast in a way that spared no one's face. He ordered the ritual to conclude with a harsher verdict than any augury could pronounce. If the omens were unfriendly, the fleet would march on sea's edge with a different set of risks. The hull's groaned. Men shifted their weight from one leg to the other. Tar and brine rose in a semitone of scent, and the decision was made. Some said to appease the gods, others to protect the fleet's pride. Then, in one motion that would haunt Roman memory, the sacred fowls were thrown overboard. Entreaties drowned in the roar of wind and water. A moment of breathless silence followed. Then the Carthaginian fleet, swifter and sharper at that hour, struck the Romans with a series of maneuvers that left them exposed and eventually routed. The public ritual meant to share risk and shield the commander from blame, instead tethered action to a sign that history would judge harshly. As Tacitus later recorded, the same pattern reappears in the moral economy of the Roman war machine. When a decision can be framed as divine, while the blame for misfortune disperses into the chorus of fate. The memory of Pulcher's choice became a cautionary tale about institutional safety breaks, the very mechanism that in other campaigns helped officers explain delays, calibrate risk, and preserve units. The lesson echoes through the ages. A ritual can create both permission to fight and a break on rashness, depending on who speaks within the circle of accountability. The men dashed on in the face of wounds and missiles. As Livy put it in A Different Siege, a line that readers later used to measure Roman virtue against modern bravado. The line carried a truth about Roman courage and the social expectation that glory accrued not only to the soldier, but to his troop, his gens, and his city. Modern parallels sharpen the point. Today's militaries replace sacred chickens with checklists, but the same dynamic remains. The ritualization of risk channels ambition into coordinated action, and when broken, creates spectacular losses. It would be like a naval or Air Force commander signing off on a mission with a risk-significant sign-off by a committee that has no hands on the controls, an arrangement that can empower swift, bold action or doom it to misread the signs. The Roman logic is clear. Ritualized risk management is not superstition. It is a social technology that binds hierarchy, duty, and fear into a coherent method. Pulcher's fate, tossed chickens and a routed fleet, became both a warning and a hinge, a reminder that institutions shape courage as much as courage shapes institutions. In the end, the lesson remains one of balance, between divinity and decision, between public ritual and private responsibility. An ancient pattern that still governs how armies keep people alive and states intact.